The cliffs of Saipan had never existed to witness such pain. In July 1944, American soldiers watched in horror. Japanese families were approaching the edge of the cliff step by step. Some were clinging to each other, some were praying, but mostly people were crying, and then, one by one, they threw themselves into the void. For many civilians, this was the last order they would receive in their lives. Japanese soldiers had told them that the Americans would torture them. Propaganda was their job. They had turned the Americans into monsters with claws and fangs. Surrender was described as a fate worse than death. 5-year-old Kunyi Shiroma never forgot his father's desperate warning. "The Americans will kill you. You must die yourself." Seconds later, Kunyi followed the crowd and jumped. But luckily his clothing caught on a branch and he survived. This horror was not an isolated incident. Similar scenes occurred in Tinian, Saipan, and later on a terrible scale in Okinawa. And behind all of this was the same force: fear. Fear fed by years of propaganda, fear hardened by war experiences, was taking hold of them. And the fear brought by the realization that the enemy they once despised might actually be unstoppable was a completely different feeling. So now let's ask the real question. Did the Japanese really fear the Americans during World War II? Long before Pearl Harbor, Japanese perceptions of America had been shaped by resentment and cultural friction. The United States had imposed severe economic sanctions in response to Japan's wars in China and its expansion into French Indochina. Particularly, the oil embargo threatened Japan's entire war machine. According to many Japanese citizens, America's stance was deliberately hostile and humiliating. Propaganda strengthened this even further. Americans were portrayed as weak, selfish, and lacking bushido, the warrior spirit that Japanese ideology held above all else. The West was decadent, lazy, and spiritually empty. They were technologically advanced, of course, but fundamentally soft. For a society steeped in military culture, this distinction was important. Japan believed that its collective discipline and willingness to sacrifice would triumph over America's material abundance. In short, before the war, many Japanese looked down on Americans. They didn't fear them, they despised them.
When war broke out, Japanese units came face to face with Americans for the first time in places like Guadalcanal, the Philippines, and the Solomon Islands. Their reports revealed a complex picture. On one hand, it was noted that American infantrymen were skilled sharpshooters, used grenades effectively, and always received extraordinary artillery fire support. The Japanese saw how quickly American forces adapted, how well they used combined arms power, and how effectively they leveraged their industrial strength. However, the initial assessments still reflected pre-war arrogance. Japanese officers wrote that Americans lacked initiative, were weak at reconnaissance, and were overly dependent on firepower. Supply depots were described as extravagant, which reinforced the belief that Americans were spoiled and soft. At this stage, the Japanese still viewed their enemies as capable but spiritually inferior. This perception would not last long. Toward the end of 1943, something changed. Despite heavy casualties, American forces continued to advance. The U.S. Navy was replacing sunken ships at an astonishing rate. Lost aircraft were being replaced in greater numbers. Infantry divisions rotated fresh troops into battle, while Japan's ranks grew thinner and filled with younger soldiers. For Japanese soldiers, this was unsettling. The vast, distant, and untouchable American industrial power was an enemy in itself. Diaries and interrogations reveal comments like, "They never stopped coming. Their ships returned faster than we could sink them. It's like fighting the tide." This was the beginning of genuine fear, not fear of American courage, but fear of American inevitability. As the Pacific Campaign intensified, one group in particular began to symbolize American savagery, the U.S. Marine Corps. From Guadalcanal onward, the Marines gained a reputation as relentless assault troops.
Japanese propaganda amplified this reputation and portrayed the Marines as inhuman barbarians, murderers, sadists, and even criminals recruited from prisons. Absurd rumors spread. It was claimed that Marines were forced to kill their own families to prove their loyalty. Crazy, yes, but effective. Many Japanese soldiers came to believe that surrendering to the Marines was equivalent to torture or execution. Civilians also embraced this belief, paving the way for the mass suicides that would shock American soldiers in 1944 and 1945.
When American forces reached Saipan, fear among the Japanese people had reached its peak. After brutal fighting and a final desperate banzai charge, Japanese defenders were shattered. The civilians, who had been convinced for years that Americans were monsters, now faced what they believed was their fate. Hundreds, perhaps more than 1,000 people chose suicide. American soldiers' diary entries described these scenes with disbelief. Entire families calmly walking to the edge of the cliff, bowing toward the sea, and jumping hand in hand. U.S. troops tried to shout assurances, even deployed Japanese-speaking interpreters, but it had little effect. Fear had replaced reason. Of Saipan's approximately 20,000 civilians, up to 13,000 died during the battle. Although exact numbers are difficult to verify, this tragedy made one thing undeniable. Japan's wartime propaganda had been all too successful. As the war continued, several factors further reinforced Japanese fear. First were fake surrenders and brutal close-quarters combat. Japanese soldiers frequently pretended to surrender, then detonated grenades or used knives at point-blank range. U.S. medics, most moving unarmed, were killed this way. American troops learned not to trust surrender gestures, which led to genuine surrenders sometimes being met with preemptive fire. To Japanese observers, this looked like proof of American savagery. Second was trophy-taking. Although not widespread, incidents of skull, tooth, and ear collection by some American soldiers horrified both the Japanese and the American High Command, which eventually imposed strict prohibitions. Japanese civilians and soldiers frequently heard rumors, some were true, most were exaggerated, that Americans collected body parts as trophies. Given the climate of mutual dehumanization, these stories spread rapidly once the media and newspapers got hold of them. They became another reason why surrender seemed impossible. Third was American firepower. Perhaps nothing created more fear than American artillery and naval bombardment. Japanese diaries frequently mention the earth-shaking power of U.S. naval guns, nighttime bombardments that made sleep impossible, and shells falling endlessly. For soldiers raised to believe in spiritual power over machines, this display of overwhelming industrial might was psychologically devastating. By 1945, the Pacific War had become a feedback loop of terror. Japan taught its people that Americans were monsters. Japanese soldiers acted in ways that hardened Americans into distrust. American responses confirmed Japanese fears, which in turn justified more resistance and more brutality. Neither side saw the other as fully human anymore. Okinawa, just 340 miles from mainland Japan, was the Pacific's final and bloodiest battle. 150,000 civilians died, many caught between two armies. More were forced into labor, and thousands were encouraged or coerced to commit suicide rather than surrender. When U.S. planners examined Okinawa's casualty rates, they concluded that an invasion of Japan could result in millions of deaths on both the Allied and Japanese sides. Meanwhile, the Japanese government broadcast increasingly desperate propaganda, calling on civilians to resist to the death and warning again that Americans would commit atrocities against anyone who surrendered. Fear had consumed the home islands. However, when American forces finally occupied the country after Japan's surrender, many civilians were shocked to be met with professionalism and restraint. This was proof that wartime propaganda had created a distorted image on both sides.
So, did the Japanese fear the Americans? The answer is definitely yes, but not in a simple way. At the beginning of the war, the Japanese mocked Americans as soft and undisciplined. On the battlefield, they began to respect American firepower and adaptability. As defeat became inevitable, this respect turned into fear of American power, American brutality, and nightmares fed by propaganda. Nightmares that convinced thousands that death was preferable to capture. In the end, fear shaped how the Pacific War was fought, how civilians behaved, and how millions understood their enemy. It magnified brutality, fueled determination, and contributed to tragedies that still haunt the memory of war today.